But let me ask some questions about the way this has been set up in the administration request. Mr. Shea, can you explain why the administration has requested the NIST money through FEMA? This isn't to claim that this $16 million should count as money going to help New York City, is it?
Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that what was done was that a number of different initiatives were collected by the Office of Management and Budget and packaged, in effect, like this. And I'm not aware, although I've heard what you just said about the money being packaged for the City of New York and the State of New York, but I'm not aware of any direct conversation, certainly none that I've been involved in, where that was the case.
But why couldn't they just request the money go directly to NIST?
Well, there were discussions of that nature when the proposals first surfaced, and of course, I talked to Dr. Bement about it as part of that process, and we did talk about different ways of doing it. The fact of the matter is, for whatever reason, it ended up in the FEMA appropriation. As I've said previously, there should be no concern or hesitancy. FEMA will transfer the funds when the funds are appropriated.
How quickly can you do it?
Within
Instantly?
days. Normally, just procedurally, there's what's called a Treasury warrant that's issued, and what I would seek to do is do actually what's called an appropriation transfer, where both the funding and the authority goes directly to NIST, and there would be no reporting relationship with FEMA as a result of that.
Is NIST getting anything in the supplemental, Dr. Bement?
Yes, there are other elements in the supplemental
That go directly to NIST?
that will come directly to NIST.
Can you help
That's correct.
me understand why this wouldn't go directly to NIST? Why we got to go this convoluted? What concerns me, boy, I just hope there isn't lurking back there someone who is suggesting that this money somehow would count against the commitment to the city of New York for the recovery effort. No one is suggesting that, are they?
Well, I'm not going to assume that there wasn't a good reason. I just don't know what it was.
Okay. Okay, well, the letter from FEMA to me says any resulting codes and standards will not apply to the recovery efforts for this major disaster and are not particularly targeted to benefit the affected disaster area of New York State, City, and the State of New York. That's sort of curious language. We're going to be following up on that. The actual submission hasn't come to the Hill yet, has it, for the supplemental?
Yes, sir. It was transmitted to the Hill.
It has been, okay.
Quite a while ago now. Yeah.
Okay. Are you guys going to take a broker's fee? Or are you going to, is it the whole $16 million going to NIST?
I assure you, Mr. Chairman, the entire $16 million will go to NIST.
Entire $16 million, and you expect it within days, not anything longer than days?
Days is what I would predict at this point.
All right, let me go to Mr. Shays, because I'll have a few more. One last thing, no strings attached?
No, sir. As I said, my intention is to do what's called an appropriation transfer. It's a special mechanism used between federal agencies. It means both the money and the authority go directly to the transferee, in this case, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. There are no strings on it. It's simply...
Would anyone have any objection if we weigh in with the appropriators and say, this seems to be a sort of a silly way to do it. Why don't we just go directly to NIST? Wouldn't cause you any heartburn, would it, Mr. Shea?
No, Mr. Chairman, not at all.
Okay. Well, I don't want to cause anybody heartburn. All right. Mr. Shays.
Chairman, if there was going to be a broker's fee, there certainly wouldn't be after you asked your question. You really cover the basis on that one. There was no angle that one would get around that one. This is, I have still a number of questions, and we only have two, so I might come back after you, Mr. Chairman, just do a few now. One of my concerns is that when the people went out of both towers, they went out in a fairly orderly way. In fact, it's pretty extraordinary from what I've read and the people I've spoken with, the respect that each had for the other as they tried to go down. Some people were slow, others carried them down, and so on. But I think it's fair to say that they didn't quite think it would implode or collapse. And I'd like to just have, for the record, if it's accurate that that a building on fire isn't necessarily going to collapse within the first hour, and that these clearly were pretty extraordinary events. And my fear is that if we don't establish that for the record, we're going to have fires where people are just going to think they have to get out in the next 20 minutes, and then no one gets out. I'd like to know. I mean, we do accept the fact this was pretty extraordinary, correct? I'm nodding of heads doesn't get on the record.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, this was extraordinary. This was the first time that we had the collapse of a protected steel structure. And I think that's the whole point as we move ahead, and particularly with this proposed legislation, that we move ahead in a carefully planned approach and we don't just change building codes because of one incident.
Now, Building 7 is a building that I guess coincidentally stayed standing for 7 hours. What did we learn about that building and why it was able to endure the fire for 7 hours? I'd first like to know how it caught on fire.
I'll address that question. First of all, in discussing with the New York City Fire Department, we determined and concluded that it started on fire after or as Building 2 collapsed, that there was debris from that building that was propelled into Building 7, and that the fire started at that time.
In some cases, that debris could have had aircraft fuel on it and so on. So it was. Were these lighted timbers?
No, we think it was building contents that was propelled over there. By the time Building 2 collapsed, the aircraft fuel would not have been there anymore. It would have been consumed by that time. Then, from that point on...
And how tall a building?
It's 47 stories for Building 7. It's a big building. The fire that we were able to follow from that point on was throughout the building, but it was particularly of long duration in the lower floors around where the very large transfer elements, trusses and beams and columns were located. This building had to be built with a very random spacing of foundations because of what was there before it.
Was it a pretty traditional type building, unlike the two towers?
Above the transfer area, it was a very traditional building. At the transfer area in the lower floors, over the substation for ComEd, it had these enormous trusses that took the loads and brought them to the columns. That is the area where the fire burned for a long period of time, and it does result in one of our recommendations, and that is for key elements of that where the collapse of an element might result in the collapse of an entire building. We recommend that they be reviewed to see if they should have longer fire duration for those elements than would be necessary in the rest of the building.
And now, my understanding is, in the case of Building 7, there was no water pressure because of the breaking of water mains and so on with the collapse of the towers. Is that correct?
That's what we determined, that Building 7 collapsed prior to the time they were able to get the water pressure back up to higher levels. They didn't really get it up to normal levels, but at least get
And
some
the water we were
pressure
taking out of the Hudson River, we were trying to put into the debris on the towers to try to get out people, get them out alive.
Yes.
So what we have, though, is this incredible case study. When do you burn when do you allow a building 47 stories tall to just burn until it collapses? So there's tremendous lessons to be learned about structures from these buildings in particular?
Yes. We put a great deal of emphasis on Building 7 in our report, and we conclude that we have an understanding, we believe, of how it performed, but that we need to pin down what the source of fuel was that allowed it to burn that long.
Now, I don't know this question as well, obviously, maybe I should, but I don't know how many people it's thought were killed in that building. Did most get out?
We were not able to determine that there were any fatalities in that building. There may have been, but we could not determine that there were.
But minimal compared to, obviously, elsewhere.
Yes.
And so that should be some reassurance to people if they're in a building, a more typical building on fire, that they do have time to get out of the building.
Oh, yes. We believe that without the damage that occurred to the two towers, that buildings will stand up for a significant period of time without collapse with the fire requirements that are there now.
Now, are you able to determine if you did have proper water pressure and so on, whether that you could have prevented the fire from consuming the building?
We looked into that, discussed it quite a lot, and while we did not make a strong statement in the report, it was really beyond the scope of what we were doing. We do believe if it had been fought, they could have put it, and if they could have put it out, that there would not have been the risk of collapse to that building.
Now, I have a particular bias that the actions against the towers weren't criminal acts, they were acts of war, acts of terror. And I kind of bristle when I think of our treating this as a criminal act in which we have to prove beyond a shadow of doubt that someone did it and they were at the scene, or whatever you need to deal with in a crime. But there are, I have constituents who are interested in knowing, given that it is technically a criminal site, I have constituents who are interested to know how we can justify beginning to build on that site. Is that all the debris is entirely taken away, and so therefore there's no evidence at the site that is helpful?
I'm not an expert in the legal side of it, but you are indeed correct that the debris will soon have been all removed, and that there would not be a substantial amount of information there that I would anticipate would be useful in any trial.
Chairman, I want to, since there are only two of us, do you want me to go, or do you want to go and then I'll come back? I have about 10 more minutes of questions, and I'll be done, at the most.
Okay. All right, let me go. Just a couple
Can
more.
I just say, Mr. Chairman, that your staff has written some incredible questions that I do think we need to put on the record, and I hope you don't underestimate the value of your great staff.
I never underestimate the value of the staff. Dr. Corley, as far as you know, do the NIST plans for the follow-up investigation and research cover the areas you highlighted as needing further work?
I have reviewed their plan with and have concluded that they are covering the majority of the things that we are that we have recommended in the report. My belief is they intend in the overall program to include all of them, and have put priorities to include the ones that they consider most important first.
What would you, what's missing?
I don't think there's anything missing in the full program, presuming that gets done. In the early stage of the program, there are a couple of areas that could have heavier emphasis, just to be sure that they get done in case the program doesn't get carried out.
Have you had additional input into the plan after you've seen the initial plan? I mean, have you said, now look at NIST, we think that you should give a higher priority to this, more emphasis on this? Have you had an ongoing dialogue?
The dialogue has been started, and we hope to have continual dialogue as the program gets
And Dr.
finally
Burnett, would
defined.
you concede that maybe this added input would be valuable? You talk this thing through, and Dr. Corley may say, we think you're missing the boat on this one, why don't you give more emphasis? And then you talk it through, and maybe you would agree with it, maybe you wouldn't. But, I mean,
Our plan is still malleable. It changes. It will probably change some more. I'm sure that when we have our public hearing in New York and get further input on our plan, it will change still more.
Can you give us some indication how you decided what you would include, what you wouldn't, how you prioritized? And also, I'd like to know the central goal of the investigation.
I think going back to the central point, why these were unique incidences and why collapse occurred, there have been instances where buildings have had major fires that have burned to completion without the buildings collapsing. I mean, there are several such incidents on record. I think in this particular instance, because of the singular nature of the collapse and the effect of the fire on that collapse, we really have to understand that in much better detail. And so that is far and away, in our minds, the most critical thing to understand first, and begin to anticipate what type of technical basis we're going to have to develop in order to bring about code changes in buildings that may be subjected to either blast or terrorist attack of one kind or another. In addition to that, of course, we're very much concerned that firefighters have all the access that they need and all the tools that they need in fighting fires in tall buildings. And of course, communications have been mentioned, but protective clothing is another issue. Having access to the fire is another issue. Not being blocked in trying to enter a building and do the work that they have to do. So I would say that we consider that to be a very essential part of our early investigation. Now, there are a lot of other elements that are also critical, and that has to do with the behavior of connections under fire, the behavior of open truss structures under fire, that are central to understanding in detail just the exact sequence of the events that led up to the collapse. We think that also is essential to do early. So our initial attention is on buildings 1, 2, and 7, but the lessons learned from that part of the investigation will apply broadly to other buildings as well, because these elements are in general use in...
But shouldn't a banker's trust be reviewed? Because that's more typical of what might be expected to happen.
Well, in the case of Banker's Trust, there's no mystery about what the initiating event was. It was the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings and the debris that came from the World Trade Center buildings. Now, you're absolutely right in understanding how that impact was absorbed and how it was dampened, and also the pathways in which the load was propagated through the building. That has to be subjected to finite element analysis, and it has to be subjected to further testing. And those are the specific tests that will be part of the research and development program, which incidentally, a lot of that will be done in parallel with the investigation, so it's not as if it's being overlooked.
Finally, and this seems like an appropriate way to wind up, I want to be sure we all understand what is at stake in terms of building safety, in terms of the results of these efforts we've been talking about today. Dr. Corley, what changes in codes or research related to codes is the highest priority in following up on your investigation? You know, obviously we're not going to design against planes hitting buildings at high speed. What changes can we design for?
The items that we saw that need the most attention, other than those that deal strictly with buildings that can be identified as potential targets for terrorists, are those dealing with the fire resistance of connections. That was the one. Also related to that is the amount of fuel that is in a building, and there is a need to look into that the fuels that go into buildings today are different than they were at the time
Is that your highest priority?
those are the two highest priorities, the connections and the amount of fuel. And
Dr. Barnett?
Thank you. I'd like to add something about the connections. In Building 5, we had major collapses due to connection behavior in the fire. That's why it's a priority. Building 5's construction was similar to Building